Welcome back to a new episode and a new year where we are going to be rethinking porn addiction. If you guys are just joining us for the first time, my name is Nate, and on the top row up here on the video, we've got Jake and Hans. The three of us are kind of your average Joes who are here showing our experiences, sharing our experiences with porn and sexual imagery throughout our lives, and kind of learning to kind of deal with the stuff that we've, the emotions and the memories and all the stuff that comes with pornography use. And then down below, we have two amazing clinicians, Kristen and Doug. Kristen and Jake are married, and we are all friends. And so we have a lot of really interesting intersecting relationships, but it's led to some really fascinating conversations. This is our 12th episode. Wow. And today we're going to be talking about sexual shame. This is a topic that I know Kristen has wanted to talk about for a very long time. I've been very interested in talking about it for a very long time, in large part because of Kristen and her impact on my life. And I think it plays a huge role in the negative impact that sexual imagery has on ourselves as individuals and on our relationships. So I'm really excited to explore this topic with you guys this week. I think it's going to be a fun one.
Yeah.
Should we start off by having the three of us up top kind of talk about maybe I think it's good to start with some sort of layman's terms foundational definition of what does shame look like, feel like, how is it experienced, what was it like for us, and then maybe we can get a little bit more clinical. Does that sound good for you guys?
Yeah. I'm just imagining somebody listening right now and going, okay, what is that?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's funny because I'm sitting here on the call thinking to myself,
well, maybe I can start and kind of bridge the gap between the clinical and the everyman's, and then we can go from there. Does that sound like an okay thing?
Yeah.
So I'm kind of in a weird situation because I have a podcast about relationships, and I've been to a lot of clinical training. Some of them Kristen has produced, and I've been interested in mental health and relationship health for a really long time. And I remember my life was changed when I discovered two people. Brene Brown is one, and Tina Schermer Sellers is the other. Mm-hmm. And Tina, I found attending one of Kristen's events called the Rocky Mountain Sex Summit. And Brene Brown gave the most popular TED Talk of all time about shame and vulnerability. And I love, as a matter of fact, if you look in the description of this video, the definition of sexual shame, the first time I heard it was out of Tina Schermer Sellers' mouth at her presentation. So that's a really good place to start. But I think just boiling it down to just shame, what is shame? I think Brene Brown did a beautiful job describing it when she said the difference between shame and guilt is shame is I am bad, and guilt is I did something bad. So I think shame is more identity based. It's more self-flagellating. It's more self-loathing. It's more, there's something fundamentally wrong with me as a person. I am broken. I am not worthy of love. I am deficient. I am defective. Whereas guilt tends to be about actions or moments where it's like maybe that thing I did was a bad choice. Or I made a mistake, or I broke a promise, and it's left less of a personal attack on yourself, an affront to your character, and more of just an observation and a critique of an experience. And growing up, I remember when I heard about the whole I am bad versus I did something bad comparison, I realized that the majority of my young adult to adult life, I was inundated with thoughts of shame, of there's something wrong with me. I am broken. I'm unlovable. I have made mistakes that nobody could ever forgive. And it was terrifying. It was really heartbreaking. And then Brene, one other thing that I think is really important, one of the aspects of shame, or how shame survives and thrives, Brene Brown talks about how it needs a combination of three things, and it's secrecy, silence, and judgment. And I think to sum up the secrecy, silence, and judgment, like that was my, as Doug would probably put it, my treatment plan for anything that was sexual in my life before I got married. Basically revolved around keeping it a secret, keeping silent, and in large part judging it, or being afraid that other people would judge it. And so when I realized that shame and this secrecy, silence, and judgment cocktail, the I am bad, and then keeping these three aspects together, I realized that, like, for 20 years of my life, that was my sexual identity was wrapped around secrecy, silence, and judgment, and I'm a bad person.
Mm-hmm. Can I add one thing? I'm curious about this thing, because we've talked about this other times as well. It sounds like you were also incredibly alone.
Yes. Yeah. When you have an aspect of your life or a part of who you are as a person that you cannot share with other people, that you have to keep a secret, and that you are afraid other people will judge in the worst way, and that you yourself judge in the worst way, it's an incredibly lonely experience.
Yeah.
I think it's an incredibly human experience. I think we all have aspects or moments in our life where we felt that. Okay, I teed it up. What do you guys, Jake and Hans, what do you guys think about? That's kind of how I want to set the stage.
I like it a lot. Yeah, I think the overriding emotion that came out for me as you were talking, and I was reflecting about personal experiences and listening to some of the emotion coming out of your words, that shame in general is a very heavy topic, or can be a very heavy topic. And I agree wholeheartedly that growing up and trying to navigate my own sexual impulse or feelings or desires, and trying to reconcile those with what I heard around me primarily from my religious upbringing, was really difficult and really heavy and weighed a lot on me. And for sure, for the first, you said 20 years, I think the first 25, 30, 35, 40 years maybe of my life has been difficult for sure. In my home, my family of origin, sex wasn't talked about. It was a silent subject. So I was navigating a lot of it on my own, or gaining a lot of my external input from religion and from religion on one side and societal or community influences on the other, but there wasn't a lot in my own personal home. And I think that left me a lot to fall into a cycle of shame of, man, what I'm feeling is not okay or not acceptable, or I should not be feeling this. And that took a long time to unpack for sure.
I'm curious, Hans, what you were feeling. Was any of it pleasure?
No, I think that's a great question, Doug. I love that we come back to that so often. I think my primary conflict was I did feel pleasure around it, and that pleasure was not acceptable at that point in my life. Mm-hmm. Because of myriad of influences or external inputs. So there certainly was pleasure when I was alone. It was pleasurable. And the experience of masturbation or sexual stimulation was certainly pleasurable, but that's where the shame kicks in, I guess. Yeah. Anywhere outside of just myself in my bedroom, that was nothing about it was okay for many, many, many years.
Well, I feel like the pleasure compounds the shame.
Yeah.
Like, you feel shame. I felt shame for looking at sexual imagery and masturbating. And then I felt shame on top of that because I enjoyed it. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's one thing to do the thing. Right. And then it's another thing to enjoy doing the thing that you know you shouldn't be doing.
Right.
And so it was almost like The difference between having a shovel to dig a hole in and then having like a whole tractor that would just dig a hole. And I feel like the pleasure that was associated with the shameful behaviors just made the shame hole even deeper.
The backhoe of pleasure.
Yeah.
I have a thought, but Jake, I want to hear kind of some of your thoughts so far before I share an insight that I had at some point in my life.
Well, I mean, I think it's a very similar situation that we all feel. And I think for me, the step that I came to, like the sort of the next logical step for me was that pleasure was bad, you know? And so when Doug comes up and he says sexual health is the balance of safety and pleasure, that was really, I mean, truthfully, I'm still sort of trying to process that because, and we've sort of talked about this offline a little bit about how pleasure was never mentioned in any part of our sexual education. It was brought up, or if a synonym of pleasure was brought up, it was usually in a negative context or tied to, you know, terms as like the natural man or things like that. And I think that really sort of disjointed like sex and pleasure for me very early on. And then everything after that sort of, you know, you use the word compounded, but it sort of built upon this theme of, you know, this is a big, bad, scary thing when you're a youth. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, here you go, out into the wild. And that was equally just as sort of problematic for me. And in terms of the shame cycle, I think, you know, you mentioned, I think secrecy, silence, and judgment. And we talked a little bit about this, but I would put isolation in there. You know, we talked about how heavy of a burden shame is on someone. I think if you feel guilty about something, it's not as isolating as if you feel shame around a particular topic, especially with something like sexual imagery or, you know, sexual stimulation. And I think that's one of the things. And then, you know, we mentioned the shame cycle, but I think that is one thing that I would like to get into more of is, you know, a good place to tell if you're in shame is if you do things like vowing to never do it again. I think that was my big thing is like, I set myself up for these impossible hurdles. And I wish I had someone there that'd be like, hey, this is a good indicator that you're in a shame cycle. You know, that you're feeling alone, that there's this sort of a physical burden that was attached to it that I had placed on it myself, but like I felt heavy and I felt so very alone. And I would isolate. So, you know, feeling of being alone that I think was, you know, present or not, but then I would compound that feeling by sort of self-isolating from everyone else until I got until I got fixed or until I sort of figured this out or whatever, you know, the temporary game plan to eradicate this from my life was.
That's a great point, Jake.
Yeah. Something that came out while you were talking, going back to the idea of pleasure that Doug asked about. Curious, Jake and Nate, and Chris and Doug too, if you had experience in your past also. But for me, when I was young, I didn't ever frame my sexual experiences as pleasurable. They somehow always ended up being framed as black or white and acceptable or not acceptable. And for a long time, any kind of pleasure, any kind of indulgence in sexual experience was not acceptable. So I think for lots of years, certainly until I got married, the idea of actually having any pleasure from my sexual being wasn't part of it just wasn't part of my concept of who I was or sex at all. Is that the same for you guys? You're nodding your heads. It seems like that might have been a common experience for both of us or all of us.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I'm going back to my experience, which is all I have. But for me, you know, Doug always asks, well, was it pleasurable? And if you were talking about like a time scale, okay, there would probably be like 5 to 10 seconds of pleasure, and it was just a pure physical release of pleasure, right? Yeah. And then it was met by shame, like right after. And it would continue on all the way up until whatever triggered me or whatever, and I got back into it, and then I remember even sometimes I like feel bad as I'm like looking at, pornographic imagery or things like that. I mean, I would feel bad, but I would also
Now
feel
you were
good.
trying to have more pleasure.
Yes. And that's what's hard and so I think one of the things that we don't talk about often is there became an emotional and physical disconnect for orgasm. And I think this is something that is pretty, as I've been starting to go through, my experience in preparation for these conversations, I think that's something that I don't think I've ever realized how profound of effect that had on me. That physically it felt pleasurable, but mentally and emotionally, because that was all in my headspace, it felt anything but.
Yeah.
And then I started to have this really disconnect between the physical pleasure and then the emotional and mental pleasure that should accompany it. But because of the external influences that are telling me this is bad, this is wrong, and using, really heavy language, like anyone who does this ever, it just weighs on you.
So few things are more pleasurable than an orgasm, and then few things are more like gross and icky than the couple seconds after you finish orgasming after looking at porn. It's like you have this orgasm and it's this pleasure, and then right when it's over, you're like, oh.
Right. See, Nate, it's not the seconds afterwards. It's the shame afterwards.
Right.
The
shame that hits.
Shame.
You go, why did I do that?
That's great, Doug. Yeah, it's the shame afterwards. And getting back to the definition of shame, that dark, depressed, oh my, what have I done again feeling is, yeah.
I was going to ask Kristen a question. Can I set you up, Kristen?
Sure. Because in listening to you all speak, it's the observations of the themes that you're sharing with your experience. And I've done this with clients where there is an actual working definition of sexual shame that I think helps piece some of these things together and bring some more context to this discussion. Would that be okay to shift there for a minute?
Yeah.
And let me give a little bit of background, because Brene Brown really was the first person to bring shame into public discourse. She's the first person who's like, this is worth studying. Kind of like how studying happiness has become a thing and people are like, why would you study happiness? But it's a profound science. Brene came on, and then the formal definition of sexual shame didn't even make it until 2017. So it's in its infancy. So really our understanding of it is new. We say it often, like shame, get rid of the shame, heal the shame. But what we're healing, what we're trying to do, that can still feel really ambiguous for people. So tell me as I say this, and I'll say it slowly, that I heard all of you in all of your stories in a bit of this definition, okay? And this is the work of Dr. Noel Clark up at Seattle Pacific University. So I want to name it because this is profound contribution to everything. Sexual shame is a visceral feeling of humiliation and disgust toward one's own body and identity as a sexual being. That one sentence alone. You all named a variation of that. And a belief of being abnormal, inferior, and unworthy. This feeling can be internalized, but also manifests in interpersonal relationships, having a negative impact on trust, communication, and physical and emotional intimacy. So there's these consequences. It's not just you, it's also in how you're interacting with the people around you. And this is important. This is what I heard in all of you as well. Sexual shame develops across the lifespan in interactions with interpersonal relationships, one's culture, and one's society. You all named religion. You all named your family. You talked about the community. That's all developing. And subsequent critical self-appraisal. So it starts to create this feedback loop. I am bad. Church tells me I'm bad. I am bad. I must be bad. And it just goes and goes and goes and goes. There is also a fear and uncertainty related to one's power or right to make decisions, including safety decisions related to sexual encounters, along with an internalized judgment towards one's own sexual desire. Or we could replace that with pleasure. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because this is something, as you were developing your sexual self, your sexual shame was developing right alongside it. And because it's hard to parse out. And in some ways,
what would you think it would be really important for our listeners to harvest from what you said? You've studied this, you've thought about this. What would you want them to have heard, really, that's important for them to hear from what you just read to us?
To understand that shame is and this is where I was heading, is that shame is a complex emotion and feeling that's hard to parse out, that at times people are trying to identify the shame as if it's a broken wire, a singular thing that if I can find that broken wire, fix the wire, I will be healed. But it's shame, unfortunately, and the reality is part of our wiring, how we develop in our sexual identity, and to be kind and patient and to start being able to name the shame, I guess. Like when you guys were talking, and Hans, you've said this almost in many of our episodes, that shame breaks down when stories are shared in safe spaces, because it gets validated. You realize you're not alone. Your feelings get normalized. There's a name to it. So it's just starting to have people understand that shame has a deep impact on relationships, the ability to say yes or no in a sexual encounter, to experience pleasure. It disrupts the ability to trust your own instincts and your intuition, to accept pleasure. That shame impacts all these things, and that it's a very worthwhile endeavor to understand sexual shame and its impact on your life, because it can be debilitating.
So as I listen, I'm going to suggest there's two ideas in the room. There's what sexual shame is. What's the physical body? What's the actual moments and experiences of having this experience? What's that like? And then there's reverberations from that experience throughout our lifespan in the context of. So I find myself less drawn to the immediate consequences that could be so many. I'm really interested in how rare it is to talk about the experience itself. When Nate covered his face and remembered what that shame was like, that you said it, Kristen, it's visceral, it's in the body, it's like something, it's inescapable, it's in our pores when we're having it. And that's the part I find is so rarely discussed. And that we're talking about having this experience in the middle of trying to experience, as Nate said, one of the most joyous experiences our human body's been designed to give us.
Yes.
There's something really warped about that, and I don't know how to describe it other than that. That's what I'm struck by. Is that.
And I think it's worth pointing out that I don't know if this is worth talking about, but I'm going to give it a shot. What I was taught about shame growing up is that the shame that you feel looking at pornography is your spirit telling you that you're doing something wrong. It's God saying you are doing something you shouldn't be doing right now. And that's the way he communicates to you that you've done something bad. Whether implicitly or explicitly, that's kind of the message that I received. And as I've learned and studied about shame, I've started to realize that no, it's actually the culture that teaches that creates the shame.
Mm-hmm.
Can you slow that down, Nate? How do you know that? Well, you say that so confidently. You learned something. What did you learn that lets you say that so clearly?
It's a weird story for me to tell, and some people won't understand the weirdness of it, but I was raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon faith. And I felt in my late 20s, what I learned was shame, like crushing shame, constant imposter syndrome, fear that I wasn't good enough, fear that I was going to be found out, fear that if my leaders or my parents or my friends found out who I truly was or what things I had done, that I would just be this giant walking disappointment. And I walked around with that for, up until my late 20s. And I got to a point where I was like, I can't do this anymore. And so at like 27 or 28, I was like, I think I just need to be done with church. Like it feels like my religion, my church, that community, the atmosphere I was raised in is that's where I'm feeling the most of that negative stuff coming towards me. Like these negative, that's kind of the source. It's what it felt like. And I was like, I'm going to move away from my friends and family. So I moved to Orlando, Florida from Salt Lake City, and I'm going to just spend some time alone and distance myself from my religion and my community and see that if distancing myself from this narrative will, if I distance myself from that narrative, will the shame feeling also go away? And I did, and it did. And
what did you learn from that? What did you learn from that? What was it about that was so important to learn?
It made me realize. I want to be careful how I say this, because since that experience, I've come back to being a practicing religious person, but I had to figure out my relationship with myself first. And I think what I learned is that my entire life growing up, I believed that that religion, the church I was raised in, was the source of happiness and joy and positive things and salvation, and like anything positive that you can think of. At the core of that was my faith. And I realized that that religion is a tool that can be wielded for good or for evil. And you can create like unity, love, and compassion. You can use your religion as a force for good in the world, but religion can also cause people extreme pain. And it can also generate massive amounts of shame, and it can be very damaging and destructive. And I don't think I understood that. I think I understood it in generalities, but I don't think I truly understood it until I experienced pain from the supposed source of happiness. Of like, church isn't supposed to make you hurt, unless that hurt makes you better. And all I could feel was worse. And I think that was my big thing, is realizing that you can take something really good and you can use it the wrong way, and it can cause a lot of pain and do a lot of damage and create a lot of harm if you use it the wrong way. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Am I being clear?
It's really important to hear how you came to know this.
Yeah. Well, and I hear, Nate, that again, there are, at least what stuck came out to me is there are religious communities, like I think of the Unitarian, this could go get us off in the weeds, but they're a very inclusive, affirming religious organization promoting sexual health education across the lifespan. And I'm not saying one is better or worse, but the messages that can be delivered can be very harmful. And the way that the way they land in an individual's life can, and then their family environment, creating that connection can be really like that internalization of how you interpreted those messages and applied them to your life. It just, there's nothing profound for me to say here other than like, yes.
I bet you if you got 9 guys who were raised LES in the 90s and 2000s and put them in a room, most of them, if not all of them, would have a very similar experience to what Nate had. I mean, I know I did, and I think that's one of the things that at some point in time you have to take your spirituality, you have to take ownership of your spirituality. And we, all 3 of us, came from a background where it was fed to us in a very specific manner, and it was labeled as the source of all happiness, and there were definite steps to it and everything. And so I think that's one of the things that's really important to clarify is, so a lot of this messaging that was given to us was given by trusted, respected people. It was given by our parents or people our parents vouched for, and it was
with good intentions.
often and given to us as young kids and continued throughout our adolescence. And so, you know, it took Nate leaving, actually removing himself from the source of this to sort of to identify and figure it out. You know, when you were talking about your experience with, you know, feeling this way and you had to get out, you had to decide, the word that came to me was smothering, because I think that's how I ultimately at some point in time was that I was being smothered. And then I think when you start to look outside of the lens, and then the other point that I just want to say out there is, when you're teaching something to a 14-year-old, the only thing you can control is how the message is sent. You can't control how the message is received. And so I know there's so many people out there that have tried to do their best on a difficult subject to help, you know, teach and to raise these young men and women. But at the same time, you have no idea how that message is going to be received by that 14-year-old, through 16-year-old, through 18-year-old, through 25-year-old, through whatever. And for me, I was one of those ones where I took it literal. I took it in the most accurate sense of it. And I remember 14 years old, I assumed from something else completely entirely different. There was a message given to me, but the way I received it, I figured I was hellbound no matter what, ifs, ands, or buts, because I didn't check certain qualification boxes. That was never the intent of the message. Just like so much of this shame that we've been, you know, come into or sort of taught, quite frankly, I don't think that was the intention behind it, but I do think it's been systemic in that if we got those guys in a room, 9 out of 10 or maybe 99 out of 100 would probably go, yeah, I was in the same boat. And they all had to, you know, through their adulthood, had to figure out either reconciling it or, you know, maybe it worked out for them, or they were like me, where you were just butting up against this and constantly hitting your head against the ceiling until suddenly you're like, I am going to break, or something has got to give. And you relieve yourself and you remove yourself, and you don't have that smothering. You can kind of come up for air. And with that fresh air, you get this sort of new perspective.
Where does the idea of porn addiction come into your stories with this story of shame?
The first time I heard the word like porn addiction together, I was probably 13 years old. And it was given by a leader in our church over television to a meeting that only men participated in. And it was labeled Satan's greatest tool. It was, the imagery associated with it was iron chains that would drag you down to hell.
I remember that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Very. And this is heavy. And I mean, I was 12 or 13. And I think ever since then, pornography, although it wasn't overtly said throughout like my individual church, you know, lessons, sexual imagery, so pornography and masturbation became one and the same, and they both became sort of one-way tickets to hell. Like I remember all these lessons of like digging holes and you can't get out because of I remember one leader like drew on the whiteboard and had this like slippery slope type thing, right?
Hey, Jake, what's the one thing worse that you could do after masturbating and looking at porn?
Like worse than that? I don't know. I failed these classes.
No. I was just wondering if this.
I know it, and I didn't even get the messages you guys got.
Wait, what is it?
Killing someone?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
It was like
the first thing I said was murder,
and then something that would make you immoral or unclean or unchaste. That was like the severity. So you could take somebody's life, or you could look at porn and masturbate, and they were just like a small margin between the severity of the two.
And I remember in 9th grade seminary being told by my peers now, these are like 17-year-olds, right? Or 16-year-olds, that the reason why masturbation and pornography usage was so bad because it was the same as adultery for those who are married.
Yeah.
This was, I mean, multiple times I heard that, right? And adultery is one of the 10. It's the biggest thing. Like we make promises and all, like, so that, like, again, message upon message upon message, and you're just going, whoa.
Jake, you said something that I thought was, we had a conversation over our Christmas break, and you talked about how kids, you know, they're really trusting adults in their life. And when you get an endorsement from your parent about another adult in your life, kids really they just trust them. There's an inherent trust, and what they're saying then becomes truth and fact. And you caused me to pause of all of the adults that we had possibly have I don't know if exposed our children to, I don't know if that's the right word, but that have had influence on our children that have shared a similar message of shame around sexuality. And because our kids got the parent endorsement, it must be true. Therefore, they are bad, or I am bad, or we are bad, because all of these parents in the room that we hang out with every week are all agreeing about the exact same thing. So I must be terrible. And none of the adults in the room are looking at pornography. Like there's almost like this assumption too, that it's just me because they're all telling me it's bad. None of them are looking at. Do you see what I'm saying there? Of this is a me thing.
Absolutely. I mean, every adult that I knew and trusted was a part of my faith, including my teachers at school, who, although they weren't saying the same things, there was physical signs that they were obviously, you know, Latter-day Saints and et cetera, and so that they bought into this too. And it was hard for me to start to distinguish of like, wait, this might not be the case. It wasn't until way, way, way later that, you know, I had the pause of like, maybe it's not true. That was the other thing that I think really compounded my shame, is all of this was presented in an envelope of truth. And it was sworn or testified to me on a regular basis. And so if I felt different or abnormal, which are two words that I think we brought up in the definition, but I started to feel abnormal and different because I felt these things. They were very real things, but they were flying in the face of everyone else in the room, or especially the men at the front of the room teaching me.
So when you say fly in the face of everything you were taught, that to me, that sounds like one of the elements Kristen talked about was shame as well, that there's something so defective and different and wrong about you. You look around your world and every single influence that reinforces you as a good person and as a person of people care about and love and want to be around and are proud of, and all the things children want to have around the people around them. You know, this part of you never gets seen in that light, ever.
No.
And so that must mean there's something really wrong with you. Children have to have a story. They got to come up with something that explains this.
So what impact does that have on a marriage? And maybe,
so in other words, what you're saying, let's fast forward, because Kristen said there's consequences to this sexual shame. Now you're getting to consequences, Nate. So,
right.
You know, Kristen talked about there's lots of consequences, and the one that's really interesting here, okay, now you're going to fall in love and you're going to be with a partner and you're going to get married and have a relationship, and this is all there too.
And you bring all this with you.
Yes.
And not only that, but there's another side. I mean, I want to address this, but I also want to just like point out that there's another side to this story. And like Kristen hasn't really chimed in on her experience with shame on the wife side, like on the partner side. And I'm sure that also plays an impact. And there were experiences that you had going through this experience jointly with Jake where shame played a role.
Well, I was going to say that my developmental shame, and this is important to remember, my flavor is different because of my gender. So I got different messages, and then my family and all of that. But my shame was should have been, it wasn't, but it should have been centered around being a good girl, pure, chaste, virgin, all of that.
Virtuous.
Uh-huh.
No sexual debut until you're married.
None, no. And that wasn't like, but then this is where I think worlds can collide, because I find that men, what they know, until I've posed this, I'm curious for you all, because you're taught in your development to confess. So it becomes less a relationship with your spouse and more of a confession, or you're caught, but it's confession. And for women, we have heard similar things, that this will destroy your husband and marriage and get out, because there's no good outcome, period. Like, that's what we're raised with. And I'm speaking for those that have grown up in conservative Christian religions. It's often similar. So it's a broad stroke. And so I know for if I'm getting personal experience, my reaction, and you see this a few episodes back, to Jake getting caught, or future confessions or whatever, probably fed right into his shame feedback loop. He's like, oh, yep, and there it is. Again, with the person I love the most. And I don't know what that is, as it relates to porn, what that experience must be like as it intersects with your marriage. Clinically, I could, but keeping it personal and in the emotional realm and in these relatable stories. But
Kristen, if your intent wasn't to shame, do you remember what it was about?
My intent wasn't to shame. It was to protect. It was to, the phrase that keeps coming up that I don't know if we've named here is probably the phrase that most of our parents grew up with and teachers used, is shame on you. Shame on you. Like, good for you. I'm feeling your shame. Get back in line. Get yourself back in alignment. Get yourself in order. Feel the shame. Because if that's what gets you back in line, great. Loathe yourself to pieces. So it kind of was that, Doug, to be honest with you, of I'm going to respond in such a way that you feel this so deeply that you get your act together, so that I feel safe, and so that I don't want to lose everything and get back in line.
Do you feel like that response was fueled by your own shame?
Fear. It wasn't. It was fear. Straight up fear.
Can you say more about that?
I think a lot of women are just on the cusp of waiting for that confession or catching. They're always peeking around the corner. It's more of a not if, but when. When will I catch them? When will the truth? Because that's the culture and community. Like, there was a research study that when LDS bishops changed how they asked Mormon men about their pornography use.
When was the last time you looked at it instead of?
If you looked at porn to when was the last time, that one subtle change in the question jumped up to 93% in this pilot study. And so I think a lot of religious women are just waiting. And
you know what it sounds like? It sounds like a marriage when it comes to sexual imagery and pornography, or sexual imagery. It could be getting a ticket to a horror movie, and you never know when the scary moment's going to happen. And you're just waiting. You're just waiting for the moment, but you paid the ticket for it. I mean, you actually entered the theater. You know that it's coming.
You just don't know when, which is what makes it terrible.
Yeah. Or you sign up for marriage and it's...
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's just that feeling is really hard to develop a foundation of trust and safety to then relax into pleasure, is what we'll say. But you're just waiting because your neighbor just got the disclosure and your sister's going through a divorce because of it. And it's everywhere in your mind, in your world, and you're only hearing the horror stories. That's it.
And so what are you waiting for when you're in that state of fear? Like what is the fear?
That I'm going to exploited, that I'm going to get taken down a path and I'm not going to see it coming, and I'm going to believe and be taken advantage of and get really hurt for trusting. That's the
There's that sexual health principle, Kristen, of non-exploitation. That the fear is that this person I love and I want to spend my life with, is somebody I have to be frightened will exploit me.
Yep.
So your romantic comedy turns into a horror.
It really does. Your rom-com, the whole thing of what gets you together, it is. And this is where I empathize with couples, everybody, of it's either caught or a confession. Both aren't great. Instead of a conversation of what would we like to do with this on a foundation of trust. I don't want to scare you. I don't want to disrupt the trust we feel. So I'd love to have a conversation, but it usually comes out in confession or in caught, and that doesn't help. And I think that is why, and again, just speaking from the woman's experience, why the words trauma or betrayal trauma have come in line, because for a woman that feels traumatic, that's going back to the words of it's legitimate, but it may not be accurate, but that's the felt experience. Because it's so like, I trusted you, I committed to you. There's so many layers to this piece that I won't derail it, but that felt experience, it wasn't shame. It was a lot of fear. And how do I stay safe in this situation?
Hans, I've been missing you.
Thanks, Doug. I've been having an interesting personal experience as I've been listening. That's kind of you to invite me back in. I'm going to step back for 1 second, just back to the religious aspect, because I noticed myself feeling a lot of emotion around that, and some of it of a defensive nature with regard to it's just my personal beliefs about, and I think maybe the distinction I came to was religion versus organized religion. And I have maybe compassion and maybe some forgiveness for leaders that I knew personally and leaders of our church at a large scale that, in my opinion, did the best or do the best they can, which is what we all do. We all do the best we can with what we've got. And unfortunately, I think the dynamic of the organized religion was detrimental for me personally in a lot of ways. And Chris, what you just kind of ended with about conversation, when I finally could start having conversation with myself and conversation with others around me that became personal and that was in many ways divergent from the organized religion, but still based on many of the religious principles that were dear and sacred to me, that's when I really started to make personal progress, I think. And I guess thinking about where this conversation goes and thinking about the idea of sexual shame and unpacking it. I mean, I've sat here and unpacked some, I think in this hour, 45 minutes we've been together. I'm fascinated by the fact that so much of it comes back to conversation and the ability to have a productive, beneficial, safe, interpersonal reaction or conversation or connection with somebody, and how much of being healthy and having a healthy sexual life depends on that.
Hans, you just reminded us, and I want to emphasize this for the listeners as well, that the only way to address our sexual shame is to allow ourselves and welcome that we'll feel it when we revisit it. I mean, there's no way to have this conversation without having some feelings in your body that are like, oh my God, that's how awful it felt. I remember it and I feel it. I mean, when Nate covered his face and Jake and told those stories that did, we're going to feel it. It's not going to be a neutral experience to talk about all this.
No, it's really not neutral. And it's really uncomfortable. I mean, not just neutral. It's very, for me personally, very uncomfortable at times. And I think so I guess some kind of pivotal moments in our lives have been shared in this talk so far. The one pivotal moment for me that I really took a long time to get to when it came to understanding or moving past my own personal shame was that I am a sexual being, or a component of me is sexual. And I think in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints growing up, that was not an acceptable part of being for a long, long time. And so being able to reconcile my own personal feeling, my own conviction, my own belief and understanding around being a sexual being, and how do I reconcile that against many of the teachings of the church, was a pivotal moment for me. But being able to accept the fact that I am a sexual being, and I get pleasure from sex and having sexual encounters was a big step for me when it came to overcoming the pain and the shame that I felt of having those emotions and those experiences in life.
See, that, I think that's something we probably don't talk about like enough, is there is the other side.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like all of us are having very visceral responses to talking about our shame in the past. And I know I personally still feel like remnants of shame. It's still there. It will probably be with me until it's no longer with me. But it's not there nearly as much. And it doesn't dominate the conversation that goes in my head and in my heart. And it did. And it did for a long time. And Hans mentioned, these conversations are so important. And sometimes you don't even know who to have them with. And it is so, for me, it was so incredibly vulnerable to say these things, because I always felt like I was alone.
Yeah.
Always. Even when they changed the question of like, when was the last time, I still somehow had it in my head that I was deficient and broken and I was alone. But then once you do have these conversations, once you start to look at this from a different perspective, like it gets better, right? It feels better. Ultimately, Chrissy and I, when we first got married, masturbation and pornography was a divorceable offense. And in no uncertain terms was that told to me many, many, many times. That's a heavy thing to carry. It's a terrible thing to carry then when you have slip-ups or there's this whole other side that you don't even know what to do with. And we went through many conversations and many battles, I would even say, right? But we got through to the other side. And it's like our relationship is true now, where before it was a facade that met the standards that we were told to meet. And I would never go back to having that facade and appearing like everything's awesome and feeling like how I felt. I would much rather be who I am today and acknowledge my sexuality and that I'm a sexual being, and that I have a responsibility towards my partner, that we have made promises, that we have made agreements together, but that I am who I am and she is who she is. And it feels light and it feels refreshing, and it's taken work to get there. It's taken a ton of work. But part of me wishes I had a time machine so I could go back and start some of that work at 17 years old, of having someone at the front of the room not say, if you masturbate, you're going to hell, but say, look, celibacy is hard because we are all sexual. And this is something that could potentially ramp out of control, because there are cases where that happens.
Yeah.
It's usually caused by something else, and this is symptomatic behavior, but this is a thing, guys. This is a thing we're all going to go through, so that there wasn't this isolation, there wasn't this aloneness, there wasn't this heaviness to it. And then, my sexual development could have occurred back then so that I could own my sexuality. Because I think ultimately at some point in time, this is about an individual owning their sexuality, not exploiting, not using it as a free pass to do what they want to do and to override their spouse or anything like that, but an acknowledgement of this is who and how I am. Well, how do we want to work with this together?
Do you guys feel like shame, after hearing all this, which was really awesome, by the way, Jake and Hans, and so vulnerable. I'm curious if you feel like the shame played a role in making the problem worse when you were dealing with it. Because we've kind of spoken to what shame is and how harmful it was. But do you feel like the shame that you felt actually maybe made you turn to sexual imagery and masturbation more than you would have otherwise?
Oh, that's a great question.
I do. I have said that in the past, that I think my own personal pit of despair or shame or those dark feelings that I had were heightened or were amplified because of my lack of ability to connect, to talk about sex, to talk about sexual impulse, any of that. So I had to try to navigate it in silence, in secrecy, and I think certainly that was my treatment plan, and it was, in my opinion, made worse because of the shame that I felt. I think if I had been able to have those conversations that Jake just mentioned a few minutes ago about, hey guys, let's talk about this. Masturbation feels really great, and sexual imagery is a way to enjoy that. And if we could have conversations about what that is and be able to name it, and maybe that's the point that I'm getting to. If we can name it, then we can start doing something with it, and then we can start making decisions around it instead of ignoring it and pretending like it doesn't exist, or just labeling it as all terrible and there's no space for it.
Hans, are you talking about when you say name it, are you naming the shame or naming the pleasure?
Oh, thanks for clarifying, Kristen. Naming both, I guess, but naming the pleasure specifically. Being able to name that pleasure is there. Pleasure is part of sex. Pleasure is part of the sexual beings that we all are. And then making decisions around having that pleasure in a safe way. We've talked about that safety and balance. That's productive, as opposed to just dismissing all pleasure and any shred of that sexuality as bad or black or immoral.
And I think this is an important thing for the various people that are listening. When you say name the pleasure, and how I don't know the word you just said, but how we're going to make decisions around it. Within, if you want, like if you have a certain value system that you want to uphold, what would that look like for you then? But now you're making decisions, and it's coming from a place of choice. And I guess I want to underscore that, because I think at times people can hear these conversations and forget that this isn't all or nothing, that you can experience pleasure, and it is rooted in values. The sexual health principles are a value-based place. And so people don't have to throw out their religious values to experience the name pleasure.
Kristen, in fact, I heard Hans kind of refer to that earlier. You kind of said you were relieved that values I hold dear,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have to discard.
Right.
I'm sort of summarizing what you said, but that was important to you, that wasn't the outcome, that you had. Right. You rid yourself of values and personal beliefs and messages from your religious community that you really value.
Totally, Doug. Thanks. It was monumental for me to recognize that I didn't have to discard my personal beliefs and my values to be able to enjoy sex and to be able to enjoy the sexual being that I was. That there is a way to reconcile those, and I feel in a much better place now, thankfully. And that's where the pleasure and the joy and the happiness can start to come in. But for me, it took recognizing that okay, I am a sexual being. I have values and beliefs and morals that are important to me. How do I now reconcile those? Was a really important turning point in my life, instead of just saying everything to do with sex is off the table except for in this situation.
Can a person who comes from a religious background find ultimately that place without reconciling or recognizing this aspect of their lives?
I don't know. I couldn't. I think, and now we're getting into religious stuff, but for me, it took really making it personal and working. I'm going to use a phrase from the church community that we grew up in. It took working it out on my own, working out my own personal belief system, working out my own salvation is what said a lot in the church. It took working out on my own personally for me to be able to reconcile those and to be able to come to a place where I can reconcile being a sexual being with important values that are represented in the Church of Jesus Christ and other Christian religions and many other non-Christian religions also. That reconciliation is an important step, but I think in my case happened at a very personal level, and my own personal belief is that it has to happen at a personal level for each of us.
Mm-hmm. I'll add one thing about your question, Jake, and I'm going to call it a way station. I think a way station along the way for many people with deep conflicted values between their faith and their sexual life, particularly in masturbation and use of imagery. A way station is porn addiction. That is a reconciling place some people seek out as a way to understand this experience. And I call it a way station because for many people, they find that perspective ultimately not a useful or helpful or enduring way to relate to this balance of safety and pleasure, is that I have a porn addiction. And so I just wanted to add that because that's the name of the show and rethinking porn. But I think identifying as a porn addict for many people is the reconciliation of this conflict.
I would agree with that, Doug. I think one of the things that I love about our show is that we're not dictating what the result is, or we're not dictating where people land. Mm-hmm. What we're trying to do is be willing to have the conversations in this room, in this vulnerable situation, and start to reconcile. And I think I hope that's evident to the listeners and the viewers that Jake, Nate, and I, and Chris and Doug in their own lives we're all reconciling our own sexual beings with everything around us and everything that is us. And that's what we're encouraging people to do, right?
That's part of the reason. It's the main reason why I wanted to even do this show in the first place, is because I still carry, like Jake said, remnants of shame. And I know the only way to get rid of that is to talk about it. And I find that the more I talk about it, and maybe you guys have experienced this since we started the show 11 episodes ago, but people are reaching out saying, you're telling my story, and the things that I'm hearing are giving me peace, and they're giving me courage to talk about it also. And ultimately, I think that the hope message at the end of this episode is prefacing shame is real. It can crush you. If you don't deal with it, it can destroy you. It can destroy your relationship. And the best way to deal with it is to have conversations like these, where you can explore from a place of curiosity and free from the secrecy, silence, and judgment cocktail and loneliness, isolation. And as you start having those conversations with people that you can trust, that shame has less and less control over you. And you start to take responsibility for your own salvation, your own destiny, your own sexual identity. And amazing things happen when you start to take responsibility and stop letting those voices in your head control who you see yourself as. So that is, we're a little over our time. Thank you all for tuning in today. We'll come back. Obviously, we never run out of stuff to talk about. So go to rethinkingpornaddiction.com if you want to check out the previous 11 episodes that we've recorded. I highly recommend starting from the beginning. And if you have questions, we have a little form, I believe, on that page and on our Facebook page as well that you can submit. And, pretty soon here, we're going to start drawing questions from the audience and talking about things that you guys really care about. So definitely do that. And we will talk to you again next